Time for chapter 6 in our book, a novel, The Persian Pickle Club by Sandra Dallas. We're going to read chapter 6. See what happens. Move my bookmark here. I was seated at the kitchen table watching Sonny eat cold pancakes when I looked out the window and saw Velma far off down the road. I knew as sure as Monday was wash day that she'd be my second visitor that morning. Every day, just after breakfast, Sonny showed up with the cream can and an appetite for anything we had left over. I'd gotten into the habit of making extra just so there'd be plenty for him. This morning it was buttermilk hotcakes with syrup. "Did you see the dead man?" Sonny asked me. He poured syrup out of the can, which was shaped like the hired man's shack, into a spoon and let it run off the spoon into the pancakes. He licked the spoon, then licked his hands where the syrup had dripped on it. I shook my head and wondered how Sonny knew about Ben Crook, but I suppose everybody in Harveyville had heard about Hiawatha finding the body, so it wasn't a surprise that the Masseys knew too. "Did a turkey buzzard fly over your head? Is that how come you know about the dead man?" I teased. "Know him? When the turkey buzzard flies over, it means you're going to find you a dead snake." Sonny looked at me as if I was feeble. "I heard Pa talking. That's how come I know. The preacher lady told him." I began clearing the dishes off the table, but I stopped at that and turned around. "Who?" "The one with them spectacles that pinch her nose. She come to the house 'cause she heard about Ma's quilts and was wanting to buy one. She offered Ma a $5 bill for her road to California, but Ma told her it weren't for sale. Then she says to Pa, 'I bet you'd sell it if and I was to give you $7. The Masseys needed every penny they could get. Still, I thought it was hateful of Lizzie Olive to tempt them to sell Zelpha's most prized possessions. "Did your Pa do it?" "Sure is hot," Sonny said. He went over to the ice box and took out an ice cube and rubbed it over his arm. Sonny liked ice cubes better than almost anything. Let me read that again. "Sure is hot," Sonny said. He went over to the ice box and took out an ice cube and rubbed it over his arms. Sonny liked ice cubes better than almost anything. He put the ice on the oilcloth and took another bite of his breakfast while I waited. I wouldn't have to repeat my question, since nothing ever got by Sonny, but he wouldn't reply until he was good and ready. Pa said, "She told you once, and I tell you again, that quilt ain't for sale." I smiled at Sonny. What did Lizzie Olive say to that? "She called Pa an old sinner and said it was shame Jesus died for people like him." Pa got her back. Pa says, "Died? I never knowed he was feeling poorly." Sonny laughed and I had to smile. Then she put her nose up high in the air, and told Pa he'd end up like the dead man that nigger found. Pa never did like preachers much. Me neither. Sonny didn't volunteer the reason why. Instead, he put his face close to the platter and shoveled another pancake directly into his mouth, then licked the syrup off his arm. He looked up when he heard footsteps on the porch, expecting to see Grover, I suppose, and when he spotted Velma, he rolled up the last pancake, shoved it into his shirt pocket, picked up the ice cube, and shot out the door so fast he made Velma blink. "Is that the squatter boy?" Velma asked, squinting at Sonny. He had made it as far as the grindstone and was perched on the iron seat behind it, pedaling, making the stone turn to beat the band. He stretched his neck like a goose so he could see us. "That is our neighbor," I corrected her, then wondered if Velma would think I was on my high horse. Velma couldn't help it if she was as nosy as Nettie and Tyrone. She was their daughter, after all. Even if she had come to tell me some made-up story explaining why she was at the Hollywood Cafe with a married man, she was my guest. I had no right to treat her as anything but company. Since I decided to be polite, I set down Sonny's dirty dishes in the sink and fluffed up my hair. I'm glad to see you too, Velma. I've been looking for an excuse to make another pot of coffee. If I'd known you were stopping by, I'd have made a coffee cake. I filled the kettle and turned on the gas. Velma narrowed her eyes, considering whether I meant what I said or was being sarcastic. She didn't reply, but looked around the kitchen instead and said, "You've got it real nice here." She was right about that. My kitchen was a great deal nicer than Nettie's, which had a smoky old cook stove and no water inside. She had to carry water from the pump in the yard. Club members didn't rub it in when they were better off, however, so I said, "It'll do," and measured out the coffee. Of course, the dust gets into everything, even the inside of the refrigerator. Last week, when I churned the butter, it looked like I'd peppered it. Grover calls this the dirty 30s. Velma didn't reply, so I stopped trying to make conversation while she wandered around the room, picking up things and looking at the bottoms as if she was hunting for price stickers. She turned over the salt cellar, spilling the salt on the floor, and said, "Oops," but she didn't apologize. I wiped up the salt to keep it from pitting the linoleum. That wasn't going to be the best visit of my life. When the coffee was ready, I got out 2 mugs, then reconsidered and took down the good cups and saucers that I used at Persian Pickle. "Rita calls coffee Java," I said, setting at Grover's place at the table. Velma was already sitting in mine. Velma didn't reply. "Have you met her?" I asked. She's kind of stuck on herself, if you ask me." "Why, she's no such thing. She's nice. She's my best friend." "Lucky you," Velma said. I shut my mouth and pushed the sugar bowl towards her. "I guess you know why I'm here," Velma said. "I suppose so." I looked Velma in the eye because I wasn't going to let her wiggle out of this. Velma took a spoon from the spooner on the table and helped herself to the sugar bowl. When she leaned over, I noticed there was an inch of dark brown on either side of the part of her hair before the bleached yellow started. Velma took a sip of coffee, and because I can't abide silence, I said, "I don't carry tales if you're worried about it." That wasn't exactly true. I gossiped as much as anybody else, but I made a point not to start the gossip. Velma studied me over the rim of her cup. You got it real nice," she said again, and this time I knew she wasn't talking about my kitchen. All of a sudden I felt sorry for her. "I wish you'd come to Persian Pickle," I blurted out, meaning it. "We have an awfully good time. I think you'd like it fine if you tried it." "Maybe if I was an old married lady living way out in the country like you, I would," she said. "Why, you're not all so old. I'm 24 now, same as Rita. You must be almost 21. It surprised me to realize that Velma was so close to my age. "I'm not married and settled down. What's there for me to talk about at that dumb club?" "I bet you will be before long. Married, I mean." "Fat chance. He's already got a wife, the man I was with. He's not a four-flusher. He told me about her right off. I expect you know about him being married." I nodded. "Did Aunt Forrest Ann tell you?" "Married men have a look to them," I lied, since I hadn't seen any more of him than the back of his head. I didn't want Velma to know Forrest Ann had told on her. "I forgot to offer you the cream. Grover and I don't take it in our coffee." I rose, but Velma put out her hand. "Dad don't know about him," she said. "I hope you aren't going to tattle." "I won't. Tyrone would blame Nettie, and I wouldn't hurt your mom for the world," I said, which was true except for Ella. Nettie had it the hardest of any of the members of the Persian Pickle. Tyrone wasn't mean exactly, but he was dumb and shiftless and self-righteous. Velma nodded, and I got up to get the coffee pot, studying Velma as I poured hers. She was hard around the eyes, but she was a good-looking girl, and I said, "Velma, with looks like yours, you don't have to take up with a married man. There are plenty of boys right here in Harveyville who would be crazy for you if you gave them half a chance. Name one." I opened my mouth to do just that, but I couldn't think of a boy her age still living in Harveyville who wasn't married or a hired man. Finally, I remembered one. If you can overlook him being a cripple, there's Doyle Tatum, I said. He's real nice. I wouldn't marry no ugly man, Velma laughed, and her face grew soft for a minute. You see what I mean? I had real hopes for Tom Ritter, but then he went off and married that Rita person. I tightened my grip on the coffee pot and wondered just what Velma meant about having hopes for Tom, but I wouldn't ask about a thing like that. Oh, I said. We were having a real good time last summer, and I thought, Velma hunched over her coffee, I don't suppose you knew about it. We didn't exactly go out to the Hollywood or even to the picture show, 'cause Tom didn't have any money. Maybe he didn't want his dad to know he was seeing me, or on account of my reputation. We just talked and stuff down by the creek. Velma waited for me to say something, but I was wondering why Tom hadn't told us about Velma. I was also trying to figure out what she meant by stuff. Maybe she was making the whole thing up. When I didn't reply, Velma added, Well, I don't have much use for a man that doesn't even write me that he got married. I let Tom know that too, the last time I had a word with him. Excuse me. At least Charlie, that's the man I was with at the Hollywood, told me right off he had a wife, even if she is so crazy jealous that she'd kill him if he asked for a divorce. That's why I respect him. He's honest. He's going to get me a job in Coffeeville. Velma was as dumb as Tyrone if she believed all that, but I knew I couldn't talk any sense into her, so I said, It's none of my business. Then I changed the subject. Your mom sure did make a good pineapple upside-down cake for Ben Crook's funeral. I'd like to have the recipe. Velma opened her mouth to say something. I think she wanted to ask me a promise to keep my mouth shut about Charlie, but she thought better of it and said, Why do you think whoever killed Mr. Crook buried him out there next to the road? I shrugged. Don't ask me. What would I know about the way murderers think? Charlie knew him. He told me Ben Crook cheated him out of $50 once, and the first chance he got, Charlie was... Velma stopped and stood up. I'm obliged to you for not saying anything. Then she paused to gulp the rest of her coffee and slipped out the door just as quick as Sonny had, leaving me to wishing I'd gotten a look at Charlie. After Velma left, I hurried to wash and dry the dishes because I'd promised Rita I'd help her with her story for the newspaper. Like Grover, I didn't see why she wanted to write another one. It meant more heartache for Ella if people kept talking about Ben. But Rita was set on it. Rita didn't want to interview folks on the telephone for fear of somebody listening in, so I volunteered to drive her around, thinking she might mention my name in the newspaper, and wouldn't that be something? Rita showed up before I'd finished drying the dishes, and I thought even people in a big city like Topeka didn't get as many visitors through the kitchen door in one morning as I did. You're a peach to do this, Queenie, Rita told me as I poured her a cup of the coffee I'd made for Velma. In her blue suit with a long skirt that was just the latest thing and a stylish little hat with a feather on it, Rita looked like she had stepped right out of the Mrs. Newlywed store in Eckridge. Good job, she added, tightening the screw on her double-decked eardrops. She took out a list from her pocketbook. These are the places I want to go. I thought I'd write them down so you could plot our trip. No use wasting gas. There were only 3 places written on the paper, so it didn't even qualify as a list. Rita could have just remembered them, but maybe that wasn't the way reporters worked. The 3 places were Ellisfield, where Ben had been buried, Mrs. Judd's house, and the sheriff's office. I asked her why she wanted to go to Mrs. Judd's. Ella's staying there, isn't she? You mean you want to ask her questions for your story? Why would you do a thing like that? Rita put down her cup, which had a bright lipstick smudge on the edge, and looked up at me. Don't be surprised. Reporters always talk to the grieving widow. It doesn't seem very polite to me. We want Ella to get over Ben's body being found. I don't think it's a nice thing to ask a friend about. I'm a reporter, Queenie, and reporters don't have friends. The remark sounded like something Rita had read in a book instead of a thing a real person would say, but I was shocked anyway. That's the worst thing I ever heard. Nothing's more important than friends. Rita laughed. Oh, Queenie, it's all right. This is just business, as they say. I can't see any difference between me interviewing a friend and Grover selling Ella a cow. That didn't sound right to me either, but I wasn't sure why. Grover would give her a cow if she needed it, I said. I know that, but it's beside the point. Are you ready to go? I scratched at a place on the linoleum tablecloth where Sonny had spilled syrup, then put my finger into my mouth. You won't make Ella talk to you if she doesn't want to, will you? I asked without looking up. Well, of course not, silly. How could I make a person do that? Grover came into the kitchen just then, washed his hands and dried them on the roller towel while I poured him the rest of the coffee from the percolator. There was just a drop, and he drank it standing up before he said, Morning, Rita. Sounds like you're going to make Harveyville famous. He must have been standing on the porch listening. Even if you could make Ella talk, you'd have to go through both of the Judds to get to her, and that'd be harder than skinning a live mule. You see, Rita said to me, Ella's safe. She put on her little, Rita said to me, Ella's safe. She put on her little white gloves and stood up. I'll just get my keys, I said. Grover had gone into the bedroom ahead of me to change his shirt because he'd gotten oil from the tractor all over himself. I closed the door, and even though I knew Rita couldn't hear me, I whispered, Grover, do you know anything about Tom fooling around with Velma Burgett? You mean now? Grover asked. I caught the dirty shirt. You mean now? Grover asked. I caught the dirty shirt before it landed on the floor, and I touched the stain with my finger. I'll never get it out. No, of course not, you dope. Tom's married. I'm talking about last summer. Grover went into the closet. You already got out your clean shirt. Look at me, I said. Grover wasn't any good at hiding a thing from me. There was nothing serious between them, Queenie. They were just out for a good time is all. Velma's not the kind of girl you marry. I guess I don't know what you mean, I said, hoping Grover would catch the edge of my voice. I knew what Grover meant, of course, but nobody, not even my husband, could criticize a member of the Persian Pickle Club that way. Hell, Queenie, you know what kind of girl I mean. She's a hussy. I couldn't let Grover get away with that. She's a pickle. What does that have to do with it? How'd you like Tom bringing Velma over here for a wiener roast on Saturday night instead of Rita? Grover buttoned up his shirt and slipped the straps of his overalls over his shoulders. I don't think Tom sees her anymore. He sat down on the bed and looked up at me. I didn't really mean about Velma being a hussy. She used to be a real nice girl. She just went to town is all. I expect she'll straighten out one of these days. Grover reached out his hand, but I didn't have time for that foolishness. Besides, Rita was in the next room. I decided to forgive him, however. So after I fished the car keys out of the Whitman's box on the dresser, I kissed Grover on the back of his sunburned neck and went out to Rita. We stopped at Ella's farm first because I was not in any hurry to take on Mrs. Judd, who would blame me for not having the good sense to keep Rita away from Ella. She'd be right too, but I couldn't think of a way to head off Rita. The minute I stopped the car next to Ella's side porch and killed the engine, Hiawatha stepped out from behind the barn and stood quietly, watching us. Rita waved and said in a friendly way, Hi there, Hiawatha. You're just the man I want to see. Hiawatha didn't move, just stood there with the pitchfork in his hands. So Rita had to get out of the car and go over to him. I was right behind her. I'm writing a story for the Topeka Enterprise, and I want to see where Ben Crook was buried. Hiawatha didn't say a word. Instead, he looked at me, and I nodded to let him know it was all right to talk to Rita. Out there, he said, pointing north with the pitchfork. Well, let's go out there, Rita said. The dirt'll spoil them shoes you got on. You drive out on the highway, go north half a mile and turn off the creek road. I'll go across the field and meet you. Hiawatha started off, but he stopped when I called to him. Don't you want to come with us, Hiawatha? There's no need for you to walk on a hot day when you can ride. He waited to see if Rita would object to him getting into the car with us, but she smiled at him and called, "Hop in." So Hiawatha stuck the pitchfork in the dirt, brushed off his clothes, and climbed into the back seat, his hat in his hand. Rita took out a little pad of paper and her fountain pen, and although I didn't know how she could write with the car bumping along, "It must have given you quite a scare finding that body out there," she said, smiling at Hiawatha again. "Old bones don't scare me none." "No, I wouldn't think anything would scare someone as big as you. What did you think when you saw that big bone sticking out of the ground?" "I thought there's a dead man there." "And right you were. Did you know who it was?" "Maybe." "Did you know for sure it was Ben Crook?" "I don't reckon I could tell a man from just his one bone." "Weren't you frightened? Weren't you afraid there might be ghosts and spooks hovering around?" I turned around in my seat to look at Hiawatha, but I couldn't tell what he was thinking. He might have been mad or hurt that Rita had asked him something so silly. If he was, he didn't show it. I thought I caught a little smile sneak across his face, but when I looked sharp, it wasn't there. "I'm a Catholic, Miss Ritter. I don't hold with the Baptist booger stuff like you folks." Even Rita had to laugh at that. She knew Hiawatha was kidding her, so she screwed the top onto her fountain pen and dropped it into her purse. Then she put her arm over the seat and asked, like she was just making conversation, "Why were you working out there anyway?" "Who said I was working there?" Hiawatha asked. Rita didn't answer. She kept staring at Hiawatha, so after a minute he went on, "All I was doing was crossing the field on my way home from the Sutter place. They give me a quarter to chop up 2 trees that the wind blew over last winter. I saw that bone sticking up in the dirt, so I squatted down and brushed it off. The wind had blown open the grave, I reckon, and if I hadn't walked past it just then, the wind would have closed it up again, and I never would have found that bone." "Then it was a lucky thing you came by when you did," Rita said. Hiawatha didn't reply. He just quirked his eyebrow like he wasn't so sure, just like the rest of us weren't so sure. We rambled right along until he reached an old section road that was pretty good considering nobody ever used it. I followed it, driving along the creek, which was dry, and over a rise to a field that had lain fallow since Ben disappeared. Hiawatha pointed toward a dip, and I pulled up. I could have found that place on my own. However, because of the tire tracks people had made through the weeds and thistle to get a look at where Ben had been buried, there were shoe prints all over. "Kid's been coming here," Hiawatha said as he pointed out bare footprints. I could see the big hole that was Ben's grave. It hadn't been filled in yet. "What are those?" Rita asked, pointing to 2 small holes just beyond Ben's graves. "It looked like maybe this here's a graveyard," Hiawatha said, sending a glance to me out the corner of my eye. Then he wiped his face with his sleeve to cover up a grin. "You mean there was more than one body?" Rita took out her fountain pen and flipped open the notebook. "I just found one is all." Hiawatha shifted from one foot to the other, then said, "Anything else you ladies want? I got work to do for Miss Ella." Rita's smile turned into a pout. "Well, I have just a few more questions for you. For one thing, do you notice anything different today from when you found the body? Except for the footprints and the tire tracks." "There wasn't 2 women folks standing here. Is that what you mean?" I giggled, but Rita scowled. "No, that's not what I mean." Hiawatha shook his head. "I got to go now. There ain't nothing more to say." He turned and started off across the field in the direction of Ella's place. Rita tried to call him back, but he kept on going, so she walked around the grave, writing down things in her notebook. "Damn it, I'm out of ink. Do you have a pencil?" I got out a runty stub I kept in the glove compartment. "What are you looking for?" I asked as I handed it to her. "Clues." "Clues? Clues to what?" "Clues to who killed Ben Crook. I'll let you in on a secret, Queenie. I wasn't kidding when I said I was going to solve this murder. The newspaper all but told me I can have a job if I do. Now, what do you think of that about that? Rita looked as pleased as our old dog, old Bob, the last time he killed a skunk. How can you solve any murder? For heaven's sakes, you never even met Ben Crook. How could you know who killed him? Well, I don't know for sure, of course, but I've got some keen ideas. Oh, damn it, that pen has got ink all over my gloves. She took off her gloves, wadded them up, and put them into her purse. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. I knew Ben, and I was living here when he was killed, and I can't tell you who did it. It's called a hunch. Reporters get them all the time. I can't tell you who it is yet. Rita stooped down by the grave and picked up a handful of dirt and let it drop, just the way Tom had the night he first brought Rita to dinner, only Rita didn't smell it. I wondered if the dirt had a dead man's smell, and I leaned over to sniff, but I didn't know the smell a body gave off after being under the ground for a year, so how could I tell? The earth smelled a little like a dead cow, however. Rita brushed off her hands. I'll tell you what, Queenie, maybe when I come up with a good theory, I'll try it out on you to see what you think. She stood up and walked to the car, wobbling a little as she stepped over the dirt clods in her high-heeled slippers. Do you think Hiawatha did it? He didn't move out here until after Ben died. That doesn't mean he didn't do it. Maybe he moved here to keep an eye on things. You know, to keep people from poking around and finding the grave. The reason Hiawatha's here is that Ella offered him a place to live. Besides, if he wanted to keep Ben's body hidden, he wouldn't have told the judge he'd found it, would he? He'd have buried it again. Rita frowned as she thought over what I'd said. That's a good point. Still, he might have found the body just to put everybody off, like Nettie said. He's pretty smart for a colored, and he's strong. I bet he could kill a man just by swatting him in the head. So could Grover, but he didn't kill Ben Crook any more than Hiawatha did. Are you finished out here? I'll get Freckles standing in the sun. I was wearing a sundress and wished I'd brought something with me to put over my shoulders. I was tired of the newspaper business. Rita took another step toward the car, then stopped and tapped her lip with my pencil. She turned around and went back to the grave and peered down into it. I know one thing for sure. Whoever killed Ben Crook had an auto. Without thinking, I put my hand on the hot metal door handle of the car, then snatched it away and spit on the burn. How do you know? Because somebody drove down this road and dumped him here. That's how I know. Because he's next to the road. Now think about it. Queenie, if you had to bury somebody as heavy as Ben, would you drag him off into the middle of the field? Of course not. It's too much trouble. You'd bury him next to the road. What if he was killed right here where he was buried, I asked. Rita thought. Maybe, but what would he have been doing out here with the killer? No, I think my first hunch is right. I guess that's let Hiawatha out. He doesn't have a car, and I doubt that he can even drive one. Maybe he had a partner. Maybe he was a hired killer and murdered Ben for somebody else. Then the two of them buried the body out here. Rita had gone too far. Who would that be? Duty? I asked sarcastically. You better just forget about Hiawatha. I said I'd help you with your story, but I don't want to meddle in something that isn't any of my business, or yours either, because you're liable to hurt somebody. There's some people like Tyrone Burgett who are just looking for any little excuse they can find to drive Hiawatha and Drury out of Harveyville. Rita came back to the car and used her hand to dust off the passenger side running board, which was in the shade. She spread out a handkerchief and sat down. I had to walk to the front of the car just to see her. Don't you want justice done? Don't you want Ella to know who killed her husband? No, I don't. Rita looked up in surprise and wiggled her finger at me, back and forth at me. Some detective you'd make. She sat looking out over the horizon, thinking, then stood up and wiped the dirt off her shoes with the handkerchief. I went back to the driver's side, and this time I used my skirt like a hot pad to cover the car door handle so I could open it. I don't want to be some detective, I told her after I'd climbed in and started the engine. I wasn't sure I wanted to go through all the aggravation just to get my name in the newspaper either, even though Ruby might see it and write me a letter. As I backed down the section road and pulled out onto the highway, heading toward the Judd's place, I chatted about the weather and told Rita how nice she looked even in the heat, hoping I could get on her good side. Besides, I was so worried that Rita's story would harm Ella. I hadn't shown the proper enthusiasm for Rita's newspaper work, and I wondered if she thought I had let her down. If so, she didn't say anything. In fact, she didn't pay any attention to me at all, just sat and stared out the window, biting her lip. So I stopped talking and enjoyed the scenery myself, thinking how nice it would be to make a quilt that looked like Kansas fields. I picked striped fabrics and cut them into squares and rectangles, setting some of them in crossways so they'd look like the way our fields did when Grover plowed them at angles. Even though most of the fields we passed were brown, I'd used green material. I'd called the quilt Better Times, and I was so pleased with the name, I thought I'd tell Mrs. Judd. I pulled in her barnyard and switched off the motor. Prosper stood beside the smokehouse watching us, and I could make out Mrs. Judd, who was just a shape behind the screen door. To show sympathy for Ella, the Judds had tied a purple mourning bow on the door. Black crepe streamers hung from it, but in the heat they looked like limp rags. I figured Ella was somewhere in the kitchen, blocked by Mrs. Judd. Rita waited for me to get out of the car, but I wasn't in any hurry to face down Mrs. Judd, who'd be mad enough to chew my eyes out when she found out why we were there. So I fiddled with the key, pretending it wouldn't come out of the ignition, then stared at the barn as if something over that way had caught my attention. Rita got out and faced the Judds by herself. "Is Ella around?" she asked Prosper. "She's sleeping," Mrs. Judd answered from inside the door. "How do, Queenie?" She didn't sound friendly, and I slumped down a little in the seat. "I want to talk to Ella," Rita said. "She's had about all the condolence calls she can take today, but thank you just the same. I'll tell her you stopped in. She'll appreciate the thought." "Oh, I didn't come to tell her I was sorry. I came to ask her some questions." That didn't sound right, even to Rita, who added, "Of course I'm sorry." What do you want to ask her questions for? Are you writing another one of those stories?" Mrs. Judd's voice boomed out from the house like a radio that had been turned up too high. "Rita thinks she's going to find out who killed Ben," I called out the window, but I could hear Mrs. Judd snort all the way to the car. Rita turned and frowned at me as if I shouldn't have told. Then she turned to Mrs. Judd with the same smile she'd given Hiawatha. "Of course, I can't promise I'll do it, but I'm going to try. It would be nice to know who the murderer is, don't you think? I imagine everybody would feel better, especially Ella, if they knew who killed Mr. Crook." "Would they?" Mrs. Judd asked. Prosper, who'd been staring at Rita, turned and looked at his wife through the screen door. "Of course they would. Everybody wants justice done, don't they?" Rita sounded cheerful, but she didn't cheer me up, and from the looks of the Judge, she didn't cheer them either. "I don't know about that. Anybody around here, everybody wants to mind their own business. It seems to me just as would be letting Ella alone. She doesn't want you or anybody else prying," Prosper told Rita. I never heard Prosper say that much at one time. Rita had removed her pad and my pencil stub from her purse when she got out of the car, but she put them back and snapped shut the lock on the pocketbook. "What I don't understand is why everybody wants to cover this up." Mrs. Judd came out from behind the screen, letting it slam behind her, making Rita jump. Before the door closed, I caught a glimpse of Ella sitting in a rocker in the kitchen. "What's that you said?" I had to admire Rita for being braver than I'd ever been. She didn't flinch one bit under Mrs. Judd's frown. I said, "It seems to me that everybody wants to cover up this murder. Nobody wants to talk about it," Rita replied. Prosper took a step toward Rita and opened his mouth, but Mrs. Judd held up her hand. "Cover up," she said, spit flying out of her mouth. "What's there to cover up? Ben Crook's death is none of your business. None of my business. Or Queenie's over there either. You're trying to stir up trouble with your newspaper stories. I don't know of anybody in Harveyville who wants their name in the newspapers." Even though Mrs. Judd couldn't see me, I blushed. "If you keep on asking fool questions like you've been doing, people will get suspicious of their neighbors and say things they don't mean. There's already kids out there digging up Ella's field looking for buried treasure because somebody said Ben was killed for money. Ben never had any money. Why do you think he'd have let Ella live like they did with no electricity or running water if he'd had money? He thought the sun rose and set." Rita cut her off. "Well, somebody must have had a reason for killing him. And what if the murderer is living right here in Harveyville? Do you want to live with the killer? What if he goes after Mr. Judd or Ella or Queenie?" I shivered, even though I was so hot. I was sweating. Mrs. Judd put her hands on her hips, stretched her neck, and puffed out her chest like a hen who just laid an egg. "There isn't anybody going after one of us that I know of." "Tima," Prosper said. Mrs. Judd turned her eyes to Prosper without turning her face. The two of them looked at each other a long time. Mrs. Judd staring through her thick spectacles, and Prosper looking right back with his beady pig eyes. I guess he was telling her something, the way married people do without talking, but I didn't know what it was. After a minute, Mrs. Judd turned her eyes back to Rita. "If I let you talk to Ella, will you promise you'll never ask her another thing about Ben Crook? Ben's dead, and he's been dead over a year. It doesn't do her any good to dig up his memory the way Hiawatha dug up his body. Ella's none too strong, and all these questions don't help her one bit. You promise you'll let her be?" Rita nodded. "All right." Rita started toward the door, but Mrs. Judd held up her hand. "I'll bring her out," she called inside in the sweet voice you'd use for a little child. "Ella, sweetheart, come out here, please, if you would. You've got a visitor from Pickle." The rocker scraped in the kitchen, and Ella, wearing her carpet slippers, shuffled out the screen door. She seemed smaller than ever since the funeral, and older, too. I jumped out of the car and ran to her and took her hand. "Why, Ella, you come and sit beside me on the swing. It's such a nice day. The fresh air will do you good." "If I'd known we'd be stopping by, I'd have brought a coochie. I made it just like my mother did. She said you were the only one who could make it better, and she always meant to ask you for your recipe." I chattered away as I led Ella to the swing, thinking Mrs. Judd would tell me to be still, but she didn't. Rita sat down in the chair next to us, and Mrs. Judd hefted her weight onto one of the porch steps. She motioned for Prosper, who came over and leaned against the porch post. Rita slipped off her hat and laid it on the floor, running her hand through her damp curls, which were as springy as Shirley Temple's. I thought she'd take out her pad and paper again, but she didn't. Maybe it was because the pencil I'd given her was 2 inches long and had been sharpened with a knife. It was all right for putting down what you needed on a grocery list, but you wouldn't want to write a newspaper story with it. "I don't want this to be painful, Ella. I'm just thinking that you might remember something that will help me find the man who killed your husband." Rita talked in the same little girl voice Mrs. Judd had used. "She's already told everything to Sheriff Eagles," Mrs. Judd butted in. Rita pretended she hadn't heard Mrs. Judd and kept on. "Maybe someone in Topeka will read the article and know who did it. Or perhaps something you say will give somebody an idea. Even the itty-bittiest thing could help." "Why would anybody in Topeka kill Ben Crook?" Mrs. Judd asked. That wasn't what Rita meant, but Rita didn't answer. Ella looked at Rita for a long time, then she gave her a sorrowful little smile and said, "Okay, Rita smiled back at her. When was the last time you saw your husband? Rita asked. June 20th of last year. Everybody knows that, Mrs. Judd answered for Ella. Rita raised her shoulders and sighed to show she was peeved at Mrs. Judd, but she kept looking at Ella. It became clear to thee that Mrs. Judd's plan was to let Rita ask Ella questions, but Mrs. Judd would answer them. After all, Mrs. Judd had promised that Rita could talk to Ella. She hadn't said anything about Ella talking back. That was the day he disappeared. I asked when was the last time Ella saw him. Are you asking Ella if she saw him after he disappeared? Prosper butted in before Mrs. Judd could answer. Rita would have done a whole lot better if she'd gotten the Judds on her side in the first place instead of going against them. Did he mention he was seeing anybody? Rita asked, and Ella shook her head. She made little bird scratches on her lap with her hands and put them into her apron pockets. They wouldn't stay still, however, and in a minute they were out of her pockets again. It was the first time I'd seen Ella sitting down without quilting or fancy work to occupy her hands. She played with the spot on the hem of her apron where the stitches holding the bias tape trim had come out. I wondered how she could have such dainty hands with all the heavy farm work she'd done in her life. Did he ever have any fights with other men, or did anybody owe him any money or threaten him? Or did you ever see someone sneaking around your farm? Was the first question Rita asked. Ella shook her head no and kept on shaking it long after Rita finished. Mrs. Judd didn't have to stop Ella from talking because Ella didn't have anything to say. Rita realized that too and gave a sigh and was quiet. Then to my surprise she turned to Prosper. I'd like to talk to you, Mr. Judd, alone if I may. Mrs. Judd protested that anything Rita had to say to Prosper could be said in front of her, but Prosper put up a little pink hand. It's all right, Mother. He and Rita walked over to the horse trough, which was iron and had green slime on its edges. Prosper stood with his back to the sun, and Rita squinted to see him. From what I could tell, she did most of the talking, while Prosper looked into the horse trough and ran his hand along the cool rim. His little eyes squinted until they were all but closed. All of a sudden, Prosper gave a sharp sound. It wasn't a word, really, just a sound that was like, huh? Or ha. I wasn't sure what it meant. He turned without so much as a glance at us and walked quickly into the barn, closing the door behind him. The barn was old, and long cracks had opened up between the wallboards when the big building shifted. I knew Prosper was standing in the gloom inside, watching us through one of those openings. Mrs. Judd stared at the closed door. Then she put a large hand on Ella's shoulder, and Ella's hand stopped scratching and lay still in her lap. Rita called, "Thanks just the same, Mr. Judd." Instead of coming back to the porch, she took jerky, high-heeled steps to the car and waited for me. I stood and reached for Rita's hat, which she had left behind on the porch, but before I could pick it up, Ella's hand shot out and grabbed it. She stroked the soft navy blue felt and carefully brushed the dust off the feather. Rita opened the car door and put a foot inside, but Ella was still playing with the hat, and I was no longer in a hurry to leave. Rita got tired of waiting and came back to the porch. "You think it'll rain?" Rita asked, like some old farmer. Mrs. Judd blinked at her without answering. Ella handed Rita her hat and said, "Pretty." Rita put it on, fastened it with the hat pin, then took Ella's hand. "I don't want to hurt you, Ella. Honest, I don't. It's just that I've got a job to do, and wouldn't you rather talk to me than some reporter you don't even know?" That sounded like a threat, and Mrs. Judd pinched in her mouth while she thought it over. "Do you mean if you weren't to write this up, somebody else would?" They'd send out a reporter from Topeka, probably one of those men who get people to confess to all kinds of things. They'd know how to do it, Rita told her. Mrs. Judd mulled that over. "I don't want outsiders bothering Ella. That's why I'm helping Rita. She'll be nice. That's why I'm helping Rita. She'll be nicer to Ella than somebody from Topeka, I put in. Instead of looking at me, Mrs. Judd put up her hand to tell me to be still. She told Rita, if they send one of those men reporters out here, you let me know. Rita and I went to the car, and I started the engine. Before I could put the Studebaker into reverse and back out onto the road, however, Mrs. Judd waved her arm and started toward us, calling my name. I stuck my head out the window, waiting for her to reach us, while I wondered if she'd scold me for my part in Rita's newspaper work. "Queenie," Miss Judd said, puffing a little, "Queenie, I'd be obliged to you for a scrap of that nice red you have with the white stars. That is, if it wouldn't rob you. I'm making me a Dresden plate, and the red'll look awful good in it." I'd been holding my breath ever since Mrs. Judd called my name, and I was so relieved that I'd let it out in a rush. Asking for a piece of yard goods was Mrs. Judd's way of telling me she didn't blame me for Rita's prying, that everything between us was normal. "I'd be proud to see it in your quilt," I said. "I'll drop it off next time I come this way." When we were out on the road, Rita took her lip between her teeth and fanned herself with it. Then she asked what Mrs. Judd had meant by asking for a piece of my fabric. I slowed down, thinking over my reply before I turned to Rita. She meant she wanted a scrap of my red with the stars in it for her Dresden plate, I said. That's all. That's the end of chapter 6. Now, what's going to happen next? See y'all later.